I'd like to start just bringing us up to date with some of the things we've talked about before and tying it in with what we're going to talk about today. But I really think where we are today is such an incredible place because it really demonstrates what it is to me that's so important about history. And I find, I call myself a historical expeditionary. I try to take people on historical journeys. And I just find that in this day and age, there's so much misunderstanding of what history is and what it can stand for and how it can help you. Everybody seems to want to take history and turn it into bullet points or make it into something that just defends their point of view. And history is a never-ending process. And this place is so incredible because, first of all, it's a chapel dedicated in large part to American history, which is pretty unusual. To be able to look at these and to see these visions that we have of different historical moments, of George Washington behind us, of the different people. But it was built because there was nothing here about that. And people came out to this area, and some places become historically important immediately, you just know. I mean, the day after Gettysburg, people were taking pictures, going up on that rock. And then other places grow on our consciousness. And this, when I give tours here, I tell people this is one of the most wonderful places there are because you're not going to find another place like this. This is this large area, national park, and there's no battle here, just this internal battle. Why I get so excited by history is that you can learn things from history that help you go forward. And that's what I try to get to people. This isn't about going back. It's about finding new ways to go forward. Today we have a big 76ers game that I'm competing with, so thank you all so much for coming here. But I joke with my son that Ben Simmons, I say he's the spokesman of your generation. Because he's a guy who after he doesn't take a shot, he doesn't play for the next year, and now he's suing the team because he says he has a disability because he got a trauma from being booed. And you can't not pay him when he's got a disability, and this is what he's arguing. And so when I try to talk to people about George Washington and today Benjamin Franklin, I'm not doing that so we can say, well, let's go back and talk about how great they were and how great America was. It's fine to go back and talk about how great they were and how great America was, but the purpose of it is these people had the same kind of issues that we have. And if you learn how successful people dealt with them and created a country and did all of the things they did, then you can do that in your own life. And that's what's exciting about this. And that's why this place is here, and that's why we honor this place. It's not just about honoring the past. It's about knowing what happened here on the past and understanding that we have something to live up to in the future. And that only happens when you get to really understand who these founders are and get to know them as people, not as paragons, not as statues, not as perfections, because none of them were any of those things. I am putting something out there that's going to be very exciting. It is the world's first pockumentary. And what it is going to be is it's going to be a podcast and a documentary on George Washington. And so I'll let you all know about that. But as you know, I interview a lot of people about George Washington. I've interviewed Joseph Ellis, I've interviewed David O. Stewart, I've interviewed Mary Thompson. So the greatest experts in the country I'm interviewing. And when I watch the History Channel now, I get pretty disappointed with their documentaries. Because have you noticed that their documentaries are half docudrama? So you're watching a documentary about Abraham Lincoln, and you see you see Doris Kearns Goodwin or serious people saying things, and then it switches to this scene, and here's Abraham Lincoln talking to his secretary, John Hay, about whether he should mail this letter to the general or not. And the problem with that is that never happened. And it's okay to have a docudrama, and then you can have documentary, but you can't mix the two, because it again starts to just chip away at people's misunderstanding of history. Gordon Meade. It's this letter he's going to send to Gordon Meade, and I personally think Lincoln just kept it to show it to the historians. But the point is, you don't get to play around and choose which history you want to believe. Too much of that has happened. Too much of that continues to happen. So when you look at history, it's not because you're going to know everything, it's because you're going to throw yourself in there and try to find out. So I hope you all listen to this documentary. It's going to have all these people talking, and it's going to be, what I'm trying to do is create something somewhat similar to the old multi-volume books they used to do. You know, no one does them much anymore. But I love those old books because you don't just learn their life. To me, a one-volume book is a curricula vitae. You're hearing their top points. But if you read Dumas Malone's book on Thomas Jefferson, you go through his life. And when he's about to take a trip, he's like, okay, what am I going to take to Paris with me? And you go through what he decides to pick, and you learn what life's like back then, because it's interesting to see the differences. So anyway, so that's going to be out there, and I hope you'll all check that out. And I think we have everybody's emails here, but if not, just come up to me and I'll give you my card and get you on the email list so you can join that. But today we're going to talk about Benjamin Franklin. Now we do certain talks about Washington's contemporaries. But there's really nobody who compares with the Washington and Franklin team. If you ask somebody about founders today, they'll talk about different people. They might talk about James Madison, or they might talk about Alexander Hamilton. They might talk about Charles Lee. I don't know. There's a lot of different people. But at the time, there was two famous Americans. Before the Revolution, there was one famous American. That was Benjamin Franklin. He was the only American that was famous all around the world. And after the Revolution, there was two famous Americans, George Washington and Benjamin Franklin. And you know, John Adams, who I love because he's got this great sense of humor. And I love reading the founders because of their lack of, they seem to lack a lot of the complaining gene that we all have, but John Adams does not lack the complaining gene. So it's sometimes kind of refreshing to read his journals, because he's got a lot to complain about. He never runs out of things to complain about. And one thing he complains about is how the history books are going to portray things, and how he'll be forgotten in the history books. And what he said was, well, you know, the history books aren't going to include me anyway. The history books are going to say Benjamin Franklin went out, flew his kite. The magical kite was hit by a bolt of electricity, which produced George Washington on his horse. And Benjamin Franklin and George Washington conducted the entirety of the war together. As I look at what happened, it is amazing how much these two people, though, did do to bring about the revolution together. Now, I'm going to start by talking about their relationship, how they get to know each other. When George Washington is a young man, of course, Franklin's older. Franklin is already famous. And I've already talked to you all about George Washington when he was young, some of the mistakes George Washington made as a very young man, his fighting with Dinwiddie, his fighting with General Braddock, and so forth. Now, during the 7 Years' War, he's trying to get along with Braddock, and Braddock wants these carriages. He needs carriages. And George Washington is asking people about carriages. Can you give us some carriages? And all of the people in Virginia are saying, no, we don't want to give up our carriages. And so Washington's telling this to Braddock, and Braddock is saying, what is wrong with these people? You know, we're here fighting for these Virginians, and they won't give us their carriages. So anyway, this comes to Benjamin Franklin. He learns about this. So he publishes an advertisement, and he puts in the advertisement that fair and equitable rental terms will be given for this 4-month campaign. Just hand over your carriages. Don't worry about the money yet. You'll get a fair term. And then he wrote in there that if they were not delivered, what he wrote was Braddock was extremely exasperated at not having received the wagons from Pennsylvania, and if they were not delivered, they would send a body of soldiers to secure them. Now, this was not true. But Franklin knows the carrot and the stick approach, right? This is what you get if you do it. You'll get fair and equitable. If you don't do it, he's going to be angry and he's going to take them away from you. So to Braddock's shock, Franklin shows up with gives him all of these carriages. And he says, what, how did you do this? Well, we want to help out. And so, of course, Braddock loves Benjamin Franklin, and George Washington hates Benjamin Franklin for this. He's furious. He's like, all the things Virginia, all Braddock talks about now is Pennsylvania this, Pennsylvania that. Everything's Pennsylvania. Now, something that Franklin and Washington both told Braddock was, the Native Americans are not that easy to defeat. You really have to worry about them. And Washington told him about that several times, and Franklin did. And he writes about this in his autobiography, which we'll talk about. He tells them that the Native Americans are very good fighters, and Braddock scoffed, these savages may indeed be a formidable enemy to your raw American militia, but upon the king's regular and disciplined troops, sir, it is impossible they should make an impression. Of course, between the French and the Native Americans, the British are going to be defeated badly in that battle, and Braddock is going to be killed, the Battle of Monongahela. Now, while Franklin is fighting on and supporting, anyway, the British side in the 7 Years' War, he's going to attend the Albany Congress, where he attempts to push forward a plan of union for the 13 colonies. So this is really interesting, because at the end of the day, you've got these two formidable people who are both fighting for the same thing. And Franklin sees it before anybody else sees it. You've all probably seen that famous picture. I didn't think of bringing a copy, but you've seen it, the snake that's cut into 13 parts. And Franklin loves the rattlesnake. Franklin thinks the rattlesnake should be our national emblem. That should be our national animal. Because he says, well, they're indigenous to North America. They never start a fight. A rattlesnake never goes and picks on somebody. And if you pick on a rattlesnake, it tells you to go away. It rattles. But if you go on, there's no more formidable enemy. So Benjamin Franklin thought the rattlesnake, that should be our national animal. They ended up, Adams liked the bald eagle better than the rattlesnake. So that's where we went. Or else our football team might be the Philadelphia Snakes. Or the Rattlers. But anyway, he's going to put out there, Franklin's going to put out this idea in Albany, which is pretty brand new, of all these colonies working together. Walter Isaacson's going to write, though he was sometimes dismissed as more a practitioner than a visionary, Franklin in Albany had helped to devise a federal concept, orderly, balanced, and enlightened, that would eventually form the basis for a unified American nation. Now in Virginia, they give the credit to Patrick Henry all the time. I grew up in Virginia. As John Adams says, in Virginia, where all ducks are swans, right? And they teach you in Virginia, Patrick Henry was the first guy who talked about us being a country, because Patrick Henry said, I am not a Virginian, I'm an American. So this is what I was taught as a child. And then when I became a historical expeditionary, I looked into it. And the truth of it was, he was at the First Continental Congress, and he and the Virginians decided, why don't we do this by population instead of by colony? Because we have like a third of the whole group. If we can do it by population, we'll control the whole thing. So of course all the other colonies, especially the smaller colonies, no, that's a terrible idea. We should each do it by the colony. Oh, I'm not a Virginian, I'm an American. We shouldn't worry about that. So you always have to look at the Virginians. They always have something behind them. Thomas Jefferson, famously, he's got this part of the Declaration of Independence where he argues against the slave trade that gets knocked down. And again, this gets taught, well, South Carolina, they were just more south. They were more for slavery. Well, of course, the truth is, Thomas Jefferson, Virginia had a surplus of slaves, and South Carolina needed slaves. So if you ended the slave trade, you're ending the competition. And South Carolina would have had to purchase slaves from Virginia. So Thomas Jefferson's slaves and the slaves of all of his friends would have been worth quite a deal more if he had gotten rid of that slave trade. But anyway, so always watch Virginians. Washington's really going to become angry with Franklin when the worst thing that he can imagine happens, which is that the British, when they're trying to decide how to put a road to what's now called Pittsburgh, the Pittsburgh area during this war, they need a road out there where George Washington is going to try to get this road through Virginia. He's part of the Ohio Company. They're all buying land out there. This is, Washington's family. You'll hear this on my documentary if you listen to it. What brings people out here is land. George Washington loves land, and when he becomes a surveyor, he's gonna look at land before he can afford land. He's gonna buy land as soon as he can. And so all these Virginians are looking at that area in Pittsburgh. To them, that's still part of Virginia. And so if England can build a road that goes straight through Virginia, that's going to save them quite a bit of money. Benjamin Franklin thinks the road should go through Pennsylvania. And the British look at this, and it just seems to be clear that it makes more sense to have it come through Pennsylvania because there's less water to traverse, it's easier to do, so they're going to do that. And that's when George Washington completely loses it and says, all is lost, it is all over, we are done for. And he tries to go around his commander and ask the British to change their mind. Comes out to Philadelphia and is treated very scornfully in Philadelphia. So this is the beginning of the relationship between these two, which makes sense. This is really the colonies at this time, right? We're really not a unified group. We're 13 competing entities. So not a big surprise that Washington and Franklin find themselves competing. Now, why is Benjamin Franklin at this point? He's already famous. Well, we're going to kind of circle back at the end and talk about his autobiography. But of course, the reason that he becomes world famous are really his inventions. Now, he's a great writer. He's written things that people have read. He's written Poor Richard's Almanac, so we all know many of the quotes that come from Poor Richard's Almanac, like a penny saved is a penny earned, and so forth. But really, it's these inventions that he does. Now, when he invents the battery. And scientists say that this discovery he comes up with about each charge having a positive and a negative, that is a Benjamin Franklin discovery. That's the biggest discovery, scientifically speaking, of the century, according to scientists. So if he just does that, then he's lived an important life. He invents a lot of other things, of course. He invents the musical instrument, the glass harmonica, which is like if you take a Coke bottle, you pour water on it and you hit it, it has a sound. So what it does is it sort of takes that idea, but it turns them and they turn and you put gloves on, and it makes this interesting sound. He's going to do everything in Philadelphia that you can do, really. He's going to bring about the library that we have. He's going to bring about the hospital by joining another individual. He's going to do the college. He's going to create the insurance company. He's going to bring about the fire department. But it's the lightning rod that makes him loved in France and in the rest of the world. This is going to save just so many lives when he comes up with this. And it just seems to people in other parts of the world that Franklin is doing something very American and very modern by actually questioning what those lightning sparks are, because that's considered God's purview up there, right? That is not something we're supposed to be fooling with. Ironically, it's the churches that are always getting hit by lightning rods because they're always the tallest building in the city. But Franklin is going to take something that is really just a parlor game, which again we talk about, take what you can gather from coincidence. He's going to look at this parlor game, and people would do things, make their hair stand up, create a shock if you kiss somebody, and this became a very fun thing to do in parties. And Franklin immediately realizes, well, this could be a source, for energy. So he's getting these ideas, the battery and so forth, but his other discovery, of course, is, well, if this is the same thing as, if these lightning bolts are the same thing as this electricity, I know how to deal with this electricity. And all these people don't have to die all this time. All these thousands of people, these cities burning down. I can protect them. I can create something that takes that electricity and puts it down into a safe place. And so that's when you have the famous time that he goes out there with the kite with his son William, and he is going to make this discovery that's going to make him world famous. When an attorney comes up to him to get him to sign a patent, which will make him a billionaire in today's numbers, everybody wants this, he says, I take a carriage every day, but I don't know who invented the wheel. He says, this is part of being in the human family. I've gotten so many things from prior generations. Your job in life is to return that and to leave things behind when you go. And we're going to talk more about that. That's his credo. That's his religion. That's what makes him go, is this idea of serving everybody around him. But he never took one penny from any of his inventions. And this is a man who grows up very poor, one of 17 children. He comes to Philadelphia, and he just has enough money to buy that bread that he famously buys, and then he eats the 3 loaves while he's walking down Market Street. So this isn't someone who was born rich. But when people talk about feeling abundance, give money away, you'll get money, that kind of thing that a lot of people talk about, that's something that Benjamin Franklin seemed to understand. He becomes a rich man. He's a great businessman. He's a great entrepreneur. But he would think anyone who lived his life to make money lived a very shoddy life. He understands that it's not fun being poor. He understands, and this makes him different from a lot of the founders. And again, it's something that connects George Washington and Benjamin Franklin. Because out of all of those Southern founders, George Washington is the one that has some understanding of money. Because, of course, Jefferson has no understanding of money. He spends it whenever. He's like my son, I think. He would totally take an Uber drive 3 minutes like my son does. Jefferson, in Virginia, there's an unreality to it all, because you grow tobacco and then you give it to England, and England pays you whatever they think they owe you, but they don't pay you in money, they pay you in credit. So it's as if you had this credit from Amazon. So you have all this great stuff, but you don't have money. But nobody really cares, because everyone's polite to everyone in the South, and it's not going to be like poor Gouverneur Morris who gets thrown in debtor's prison. You're not going to do that to Thomas Jefferson. So everyone just lives in this fiction until they die, and then everybody, then they lose all their property and their children are out of luck. And that's how so many people in Virginia and in the South lived. And George Washington, when his father dies, that's going to be the huge event of his youth. And his mother does not go and marry somebody else. His mother decides to try to survive, and a lot of people write a lot of things about her, and a lot of people don't like her because she's not always very nice to George Washington. Sometimes I feel like people are mad at their own mother when they write about George Washington's mother, Mary Ball. But George Washington understands money. And George Washington's going to read books about money and read a lot of books about agriculture. And he's going to learn about what tobacco does to the land, and he's going to learn about rotating crops. And so he has an understanding of economics that's at least a little better than most of his contemporaries. And Franklin, of course, has to make money. on his own, and he just does that by working really hard all the time. And you know, when he comes to Philadelphia, he's going to be a printer. His dad makes him a printer because he loves books. The reason Benjamin Franklin is going to become as smart as he is he reads all the time, and he does this as a very young man. If he's a printer and he binds books, he can read the book before you send it out to the person. And so that's what young Benjamin Franklin spends all of his time doing, taking these books that aren't really his necessarily and reading them. And he decides, I'd like to be a writer too. So he'll read the newspaper, or he'll read different books, or he'll read essays, and then he'll put it away and say, all right, now let me write this essay. Let me write this essay and see if I can do it better, or see if I can at least do it as good. And then he'd read his essay, and he'd read the other essay, and he'd compare, and he'd decide, well, what's better, what's worse? You know, you talk about Benjamin Franklin, who of course did not go to college, did not go to have any kind of higher education, but he's the kind of person who's doing the same kind of thing on his own. You know, he's teaching himself all the time. As a young man, and he talks about this in his autobiography, he becomes a vegetarian, and he's a teetotaler, and mainly that's just to save time. You know, I think really for the most part, it's because if he does that, he could spend more time reading and studying and working, and less time just going out and wasting time and spending money on things. So these are the kind of things that he does. Washington, before the Revolution, spends 18 years at Mount Vernon. As I say, he reads a little bit about agriculture. He learns how to do, he learns how to grow different crops. He learns how to rotate crops, but people consider him sort of a playboy. He's not considered very seriously because he is in the House of Burgesses, but he never speaks in the House of Burgesses. He's not comfortable talking. That's something he's going to have to teach himself to do. The only speech he ever made at the House of Burgesses was about pigs running on the streets, saying we should have a rule that you can't let your pigs run around the streets. So when we have the beginnings of the Revolution, what becomes the Revolution, well, first of all, Benjamin Franklin's in England. Now, George Washington is in Virginia, and Virginia is going to take one of the leading roles in supporting the Revolution, in part because they all owe money to England, so that's great. We don't have to pay our bills to England, at least if we're at war with them. But they're going to take a leading role, and Franklin is out in England, and Franklin is what you would call a moderate. He is a middle-of-the-road person during these early years. He wants to save this relationship between Great Britain and the colonies. He wants to protect it, but he wants the colonies to get the things they want. So this is just one of those incidents in the world where you can't be in the middle of the road. You have to choose a side. I think it was Julian Bond said, the only thing you see in the middle of the road are yellow lines and dead dogs. And that's how it's going to be here. You're going to have to choose. And a lot of Americans are very distrustful of Benjamin Franklin because Franklin seems to be a British person. The paintings that are made of him, he's not wearing any coonskin cap. He's wearing a wig. He loves England. He enjoys the society out there. And people feel like he's out of touch. Washington's supportive of revolutionary principles, but hopeful that war can be avoided. And Benjamin Franklin is really going to help get the Stamp Act rescinded, which I don't think he really got any credit for that at the time. I don't think people realized that they brought Franklin into the House of Commons, and Franklin spoke at great length about the reasons why the Stamp Act should be rescinded, in what ways it didn't work, the fact that the Americans were paying other kinds of taxes, the fact that the Americans had supported the war effort in very many different ways. And he talked about if you try to push this, it's going to create a huge problem between these two groups of people. And they ultimately agree with Franklin and they rescind it. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you want to look at it, that's not the end of it. We have the Tea Act, and we have the Boston Tea Party, and Benjamin Franklin, as really a moderate kind of guy, he doesn't support the Boston Tea Party at first. He doesn't think destroying the other side's property is necessarily the way to go. You know, it's funny, when I got so bored during COVID, I would actually sometimes write something in Facebook, which always turned out to be a huge disaster. And about the Boston Tea Party, there was this little meme going around that had the guy from The Office, and they do different things with him. And it said, and this was during the riots where people were breaking into the liquor stores and so forth, and all that was going on, what, 3 years ago, 2 years ago? And it had one person say, well, destroying private property is not political statement, and then under it said, well, I guess the Boston Tea Party was no good then, right, you know? So unthinkingly, I just wrote this simple little statement in Facebook that said, well, if the people in the Boston Tea Party had taken the tea home with them, it would have been a different act, you know? They didn't take the tea home. This was not a riot. This was an extremely coordinated political act. But then I was just told that winners write history, and so, you know, they probably did take the tea home. So, and then I reminded myself, don't make comments on Facebook. Because I thought maybe if I show them the quotation, you know, what am I thinking? This shows how bad COVID got for all of us. Maybe I had COVID at that time, if I had, you know, was even thinking of trying to engage in this. But anyway, the Boston Tea Party happens, and now in England, they're very furious with America. And what Franklin does, which completely backfires, is he gets his hands on this letter. And it's a letter from Governor Hutchinson in Massachusetts. And what the letter says in it, in part, is that the Americans are going to have to give up some of their liberties. And Benjamin Franklin thinks, okay, this is great. I'm going to publish this letter, and I'm going to blame Hutchinson for everything, and then maybe we can work things out. You know, then maybe we can work things out with the king. And he does see to it that the letter is published. This creates a huge problem. There's a duel of two people. One person blames the other for publishing it, and they shoot, and then the guy gets injured, and they're going to duel again. So at this point, Franklin has to say, it was me who did it. And what England does with Franklin at that point is they have him come to Parliament, and they're going to just basically call him every name in the book and say a lot of nasty things to him, particularly Solicitor General Wedderburn. He's not a gentleman. He's a liar. The whole revolution is probably Franklin. Now, as you look at this, you think, well, that's a dumb thing to do. This guy's a moderate. This guy's trying to retain the relationship. You got people out there like Sam Adams and John Hancock, and you're attacking this guy who's living in England, who's friends with Howe and everybody there. I mean, it's not a very sensible thing to do, but they do it. And Franklin just stands there, and he listens to all of this. And it's not long after that he comes back to America. And then some people say, well, see, he just got upset, and that's why. For everybody who was one of the founders, for everybody in the Revolution, there were political aspects and there were personal aspects. You know, George Washington didn't appreciate the way the British Army treated him. They didn't appreciate the way the British government treated him. Sam Adams was angry because his father was destroyed by the British when he tried to create a paper money scheme and create a bank out in Boston. There's always personal things that go along with it. But what Franklin saw was there was no fixing this. That they had gotten it into their heads that they had to have this thing go entirely their way, and that the Americans weren't going to do that. And Franklin's not choosing England over America. That's not happening. So he is going to return to America. And people talk a lot about his one big change in the Declaration of Independence. Of course, Thomas Jefferson writes the Declaration. We have that wonderful site in Philadelphia on 7th and Market Street. Maybe before I die, they'll open it again and let people visit it. But there's where Thomas Jefferson writes it, and when he's finished it, the first thing he does is he goes to show it to Benjamin Franklin. And of course, Franklin is Jefferson loves Franklin because there's so much in common between these two. You know, they're both these brilliant writers. They're both these brilliant scientists. And so he wants to show it to a professional writer, an editor. And so Franklin reads through it and he makes this one big change. It used to say, we hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable, and he changes that to self-evident, which really puts a whole different look at the thing. It makes it less emotional. It makes it less of somebody's point of view. It's just self-evident. It's a scientific truth. You know, I like what Lincoln used to say when he was interpreting the Declaration of Independence. He said, well, it all goes along with Euclid. Euclid says, if two things are equal to the same thing, then they're equal to each other. So if we all agree that the Declaration of Independence is correct and all men are created equal, everyone born has the same relationship to God, then according to Euclid, everyone has the same kind of relationship with each other. Franklin's making this less of an emotional argument or a religious argument and saying, this is self-evident. This idea of someone's born here and someone's born here, and it's ridiculous. We don't even have to argue about it. It's obvious. These truths are self-evident. We see them all around us. And to believe otherwise is to create an absurdity. And we're not even going to argue it because it's too ridiculous. It's self-evident. So it's one of the few edits that Thomas Jefferson did not get angry about. He hated all the other edits. And he was sitting there. And so I always know this because my daughter does this too. Every time she writes, she's an art writer, and every time she writes an article, she tells me, oh, it's coming out. She's got one coming out in a month in the New York Magazine. It's coming out, it's coming out. I talked to her 3 days ago. When's it coming out? Don't read it, they ruined it. And Thomas Jefferson hates what they do to the Declaration of Independence. So Benjamin Franklin sits down next to him and says, well, this is why I didn't want to write this. I don't like to let committees look over my stuff. And he tells him this joke about a sign that was like a haircut sign. And it said something like, Tom Evans haircuts for whatever. And the guy said, well, let's take the price down. That might change from time to time. And then let's take this down. And they end up taking everything off of the sign except the picture of the scissors. So that's what he's telling Thomas Jefferson while he's sitting there as if he's getting a root canal. And then where you really look at this as this really is a partnership, you got Benjamin Franklin sent out to France to become the minister to France. And you have George Washington, of course, becomes the general. And what could be more important in this story than getting France on board? It's hard to know when this war would have ended had it not been for that. Beyond all the other things, Franklin's going to meet Lafayette out there. Sends Lafayette out to George Washington. At one point, Washington writes to Franklin and says, stop sending me every Frenchman you meet and turning them into generals, because they all come out here and Congress is like, okay, he's from France, let's make this guy a general. That's what he does with Lafayette as well. And so Washington's going to meet Lafayette, who Franklin sends out. He's going to meet him in Philadelphia right before he's going to have a battle. And Washington goes up to him and he says, well, you must be very, it must be almost embarrassing for us for you to see us coming from the French army. And what he says back to Washington is, I come here to learn, not to teach. And so they become great friends. Brandywine, that's the word I was looking for, right before the Brandywine battle. But so Washington sends him that person. He also sends von Steuben, who comes out here. He meets the Baron von Steuben in France. Now, Baron von Steuben was a military leader in Prussia, and really, for whatever reason, has been shut out of the Prussian military, possibly because he was gay. And Franklin says, well, go to America. Just show up, promise to help, say you don't need any money, and you'll be taken care of the rest of your life. And so von Steuben comes out here to Valley Forge, and he's really, his statue just down the way a little bit. In a lot of ways, he's the great hero of Valley Forge, because Franklin decides when he meets him, he says, well, you know what, let's puff you up a little bit. Let's call you the Baron. They love barons in America. If we call you the Baron von Steuben, that'll sound really good. So they puff him up a little bit, and they send him out, and George Washington, whether he realizes they've puffed him up or whether he doesn't care, it's good to have somebody with a European background. But of course, really, he was a captain, and he knows all the things they need to know out here. He knows how to march. He knows how to stand at attention. He knows how to clean your weapon. He knows how to fight off bayonet attacks. And believe it or not, the Army really hasn't been taught those things. So Franklin has sent the guy who's going to really do the most to turn this group of people into an army. He's going to write this great manual that they continue to use all the way until the Civil War. And it has to be translated, so he writes it, and then Lafayette switches it into French, and then Hamilton switches it into English. And he's going to train 25 people, and those 25 people are then going to train 25 people. And he becomes really a beloved figure because he's very bombastic and yells a lot, but he's also very friendly, and he'll throw his arm around somebody, and they stay up at night and they're listening to music. People will sing, and he's got this Irish wolfhound, and if you hit a bad note, it howls. So it's like the Gong Show with his dog. But he's going to do the most to turn this thing into the army. He's going to have the most with how they perform in Monmouth. And that's Franklin. And meanwhile, what's Franklin trying to do? He's just doing everything he can to sell the French on this thing. Of course, when the British win the Battle of Brandywine, they're able to march right into Philadelphia. And they show up in Philadelphia. Now, the thing that Hal thinks is, well, we're going to join a place, we're going to go to a place, and there's so many loyalists that we can be there a little bit, and then we can leave, and we'll really hold on to this place. And that was a miscalculation. It just didn't work. It didn't work in New Jersey. It didn't work in Philadelphia. It really didn't work anywhere. It's all based to their original miscalculation that most of the people out here were very pro-England, great loyalists. And that's another thing you see in history all the time, this idea that you go to a place and everyone's going to join you. Lee thought you go to Maryland and everyone's going to join you. And in the Bay of Pigs, we show up and everyone's going to join us. And it doesn't usually happen. And it didn't happen here. People were not joining in Philadelphia. So all Philadelphia turns into for the winter is a party town, right? There's all the loyalists are there. They're having huge parties. The first day they send out an order to bring all the prostitutes from New York to Philadelphia, which they went to the City Tavern. And they're going to relax and have a good time for the winter. Meantime, out here, Washington's training his men. So anyway, somebody says to Benjamin Franklin, well, did you hear Howe captured Philadelphia? And Franklin says, no, you have it wrong. Philadelphia captured Howe. Because there's nothing you can do while you're stuck in Philadelphia. You're not doing anything. You're not getting anything done. And so anyway, they're working together, and they need each other. Washington needs Franklin because he is beloved in France. They just absolutely love him. He says, my face is more famous than the man of the moon. You know, you buy plates and his face is on it everywhere you see. And he's talking to everybody, and he's going to these parties, and he's flirting with the women, and he's playing chess, and he's doing everything the way you need to do it in France. But some people say, and Franklin convinced them. Well, you know, you don't join an alliance because you like the guy who came out to chat with you. It took Washington's work with the army, and it took the fact, in America, everybody was very upset when Washington loses the Battle of Brandywine, and then he loses the Battle of Germantown. In France, this told them we were serious. In France, it told, you know, they just lost this major battle, and then, you know, not long after that, they're fighting another battle. It made them more comfortable with being able to go forward. But Franklin made a great impression out there. Now, John Adams was sent out there at one point as well. So now you really have a problem, because these two don't get along at all. And John Adams is very concerned that the French seem to think, well, we're going to take the place of what England used to be. And John Adams could see that that's what they wanted to do. And Franklin's idea was basically, we'll worry about that later. Let's win the war, and then we'll worry about that. But Adams really annoyed a lot of people. And, you know, Franklin would write about Adams that he's a great patriot and a good man, and on some occasions, on some subjects, absolutely out of his mind. And so he wrote that, and he wrote to Congress, and he says, please get this guy out of here. And so they ordered him out of there. Later, John Adams meets with Franklin, and he's been made the Minister of Great Britain. And Franklin congratulates him. He says, you will do superbly in England. The British love a good insult. So, love a good insult. So, yeah. So anyway, so if you look at what won us that war, it's what Washington did, and it's what Franklin did to a very large degree, because you got those French who joined us, and that's, of course, how we win the Battle of Yorktown. And then we have the Constitutional Convention, is the next time they work together. Now, in between, Washington and Franklin are almost exactly the same about this. I mean, Franklin has pretty strong opinions about what a government should be, and it's not what our Constitution is. He wants a unicameral legislature. He wants much more democratic setup than our Constitution offers. But Franklin and Washington both believe the most important thing is to get a Constitution. That it will be a disaster if we don't have a Constitution. And even Jefferson says, well, if we don't have a Constitution, one state's going to ally with France, one's going to ally with England, and you're going to have this, you're going to have this, every time there's a war in Europe, you're going to have a civil war. So when George Washington finally is convinced to come out here to Philadelphia to participate in the Constitutional Convention, the very first thing he does is he shows up at Benjamin Franklin's house. And Franklin has a cask of porter that he says he set aside for the occasion. Now, it's going to be Virginia and Pennsylvania that form really the most important alliance in that Constitutional Convention. And that's going to happen because whenever you read about these events, whether it's in Annapolis, wherever it is, George Washington and whoever he's with show up on time. Nobody else does. So you always have like 5 weeks because everyone's traveling and they're riding their horses and you're waiting for the quorum to come. So it happened here in 1787 as well. So of course the Pennsylvanians were already here. So you had Madison meeting with the Pennsylvania people, you had Washington meeting with Franklin, and it's going to be that period where the Virginia plan is going to be drafted, and really Virginia and Pennsylvania are going to stick together throughout this thing. Now, Washington and Franklin are not going to participate very much within the debates of the Constitutional Convention. Of course, Franklin, very old man now. He's 81 years old. And he's got bad gout. He misses the very first day of the Constitutional Convention. I think he shows up on most of the days. But there's also this kind of strange antipathy towards Franklin from a lot of the people there. A relative of his is put up to be the secretary in the Constitutional Convention, and they vote him down. And he says, well, we should have a minister come out here and say a prayer, which happened during the Revolution. And they say, no, we don't have enough money for that. So they don't listen to him a lot, but he's always going to push for compromise. He has his one quote everybody remembers: when a broad table is to be made and the edges of planks do not fit, the artist takes a little from both and makes a good joint. In like manner here, both sides must part with some of their demands in order that they may join in some accommodating proposition. He's going to keep pushing for compromise, and one of the things he's going to say is, the older I get, the less sure I am that I'm right. And you know, people have to let go a little bit in order to make this thing work. Now, he's going to do two final things that are very important after the Constitutional Convention. The first is he's going to sign a petition to end slavery. And this is a petition put together by Quakers in Pennsylvania. And this is not something anybody in the Congress wants to see. It's kind of like, well, the way I've always described it is arguing about abortion. No one wants to do that, but that seems to be back in our world again. But it's the kind of thing you're not convincing the other side, and the people in the Congress feel like there's a lot of other things to do, but here comes this petition with Benjamin Franklin's name on it. And you know, if you saw the documentary about Benjamin Franklin, if you haven't seen it, I definitely encourage you to see it. The new documentary by Ken Burns, who does not do docudrama. He sticks with actual documentary. But there's a lot of talk about Franklin, who had slaves as a younger man, Franklin, who puts out advertisement for slave catchers, Franklin, who sells slaves in his newspaper. As a young man, he had slaves. As he got older, and it's still, we don't have any great dramatic act that we see of him releasing his slaves. We're not sure how that ends. But as he gets older, he comes not to believe in slavery. He says that what changed his mind was going to a school with white and black children, and he became convinced that the black children had the same capabilities of the white children. So he is going to sign this document, and it's going to make a lot of people upset with him, but I think he's making the record straight. He went along with the compromises in the Constitution. He felt that the Constitution was the primary matter of importance. And I think this is the first time he's able to go ahead and just put his position out there in a clear way. So he does that. When he dies, Congress refuses to go into mourning for him. They have a vote and they vote against it. So very interesting, very strange. Again, this antipathy. Meanwhile, a lot of things are happening out in France. People are celebrating him, but not so much here. Thomas Jefferson goes to George Washington, and Thomas Jefferson tells Washington that you can have the executive office go into mourning. All the executives can dress in black. You know, you can order that. You don't need to worry about the Congress. And so Jefferson writes that he proposed to General Washington that he do this. Jefferson said he declined it because he said he would not know where to draw the line if he once began that ceremony. I told him that the world had drawn so broad a line between him and Dr. Franklin on the one side and the residue of mankind on the other, that we might wear mourning for them, and the question still remained new and undecided as to all others. He thought it best, however, to avoid it. The other final act that's going to occur after he dies, of course, is the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin. And this becomes one of the most important writings that any American author has written. I've got I've got a copy of it here. And then I also have a copy of the completed autobiography. I'm going to be interviewing this guy, Mark Skousen, about that. What he did was he took the later years of Benjamin Franklin and turned that into an autobiography. But the famous autobiography is just about the young Franklin. Now, we've come here and we've talked a lot about George Washington and how his methods were to succeed and lead. And when you've asked me how do I know this, usually my answer is, well, he's not the kind of guy who writes about what he's thinking, but I know it because of his actions. Franklin, it's a whole different thing. Franklin is going to write the first self-help book in America. He's going to put it out there. He writes, and it's all addressed as a letter to his son that he really never reunited with because he stuck with the British during the war. He says, having emerged from poverty and obscurity in which I was born and bred to a state of affluence and some degree of reputation in the world, and having gone so far through life with a considerable share of felicity, the conducing means I made of, which with the blessing of God so well succeeded, my posterity may like to know, as they may find some of them suitable to their own situations, and therefore fit to be imitated. So in other words, we're going to have the first rags to riches story. This is how you can become rich. And I say rich not in the form of just economically, but have a rich life. And he's going to explain it. Now, we've had books like Confessions by St. Augustine, where we see how you can reach religious perception, but it's pretty unusual. I don't think it had been done before, this kind of book. You're not going to get this kind of book in England. Nobody wants to give a book to the poor of England and tell them how to become rich. That's not an option. So it's really the first of a genre that's going to become huge. And Franklin kind of comes and goes in our consciousness, sometimes involving this book. Because you had people like Dale Carnegie and that whole group of people who started doing self-help books. And a lot of what they wrote had to do with manipulating situations, how you shake a hand, remembering somebody's name. And then you had people going back to Franklin. And Franklin's whole point in his book is, yeah, these are things you do, but what you do is you work on yourself. And he talks about how he makes himself a better person. You've probably heard about his 13 virtues. He made a list of 13 virtues, and he would keep score for himself. And when he writes about it, he writes 13 virtues for moral perfection. It's very tongue-in-cheek. Franklin knows there is no such thing as moral perfection. So he's poking fun at his younger self. At the same time, he's saying this isn't really a bad thing to do. He talks about temperance, silence, order, resolution, frugality, industry, sincerity, justice, moderation, cleanliness, tranquility, and chastity. So those were 12, and so he was going around bragging to everybody how he did this, and somebody said, well, you missed one, humility. So he added humility at the end. But it's a wonderful book if you have the opportunity to look at it, and it's the first book of an entire genre that's going to take place in America. But Franklin's main point was always very clear from the very beginning. He argues with his parents about religion at one point, and in the midst of this argument, he writes that he says, I don't think, when I meet my maker after I die, he's not going to care what I thought. He's going to care what I did. And if you look at Franklin's life, it's just a remarkable, almost ridiculous list of things he did. If you go out to where you see Franklin's gravestone, right next to it is a list of many of the things he did, which I haven't even had time to talk about. Him being in the militia, all the things he did in Philadelphia, creating really the first college that was non-denominational. It's just outstanding and almost ridiculous to see the number of things he did, because he was just always working to improve himself. And out of all of these great things he's left behind, you can visit the graveside, of course, but you really want to see the heart of Franklin. You go out to where the first library was, at the Philosophical Society. Because that's Franklin saying something to create our first library in America. He's saying that libraries, books are not just for the rich. And in America, we have the highest literacy in the world at that time because it's not about class. And so we've had the printing press out there, but this is the first time a lot of people can get their hands on books. And I love that statue that's up in front of across the street from that building of the Philosophical Society, the first Library of Congress, that shows Franklin, and he's wrapped up in a Roman toga, and he's surrounded by books. And he's got a scepter, but he's got it upside down. And he's saying, of course, we've moved beyond the era of kings, and if we're going to have this, he wouldn't have used the word democracy, if we're going to have this republic, this is what's going to make it work. This ability to read, this desire for self-improvement, and this idea of trying to leave things for others and leave the world a better place when you die than it was when you first came to it. All right, so I'd be happy to answer any questions about Ben or his relationship with George Washington if you have any.